History is a tapestry woven with gold threads and stained with the blood of the innocent. In the early 1900s, the Russian Empire was a titan of the world. It spanned 3 continents, ruled by the House of Romanov for 3 centuries. At its head was Tsar Nicholas II, a man who inherited a kingdom of absolute power, but also a kingdom on the brink of a revolution. However, the greatest threat to the empire didn't come from the angry streets of St. Petersburg or the secret basements of communist rebels. The threat was born inside the royal nursery. The Tsar's wife, Empress Alexandra, was a woman of intense devotion and even more intense anxiety. After 4 daughters, the empire finally had its heir, Alexei. But the joy of the Romanovs turned to ice when the boy was diagnosed with hemophilia, a royal disease passed down from Queen Victoria. For Alexei, a simple fall, a bruise, or a nosebleed was a potential death sentence. The blood would not clot. The boy would scream in agony for days as internal bleeding put pressure on his joints and nerves. The doctors, the best in Europe, were powerless. They could only watch the future king of Russia wither away. Desperate, the Empress turned away from science and toward the supernatural. She began to believe that only a man of God could save her son. And in 1905, the palace doors opened for a man who smelled of the Siberian earth and cheap wine. A man with eyes that seemed to burn through your very soul. His name was Grigori Rasputin. When he first approached the dying boy's bed, he didn't use medicine. He whispered, he prayed, and miraculously, the bleeding stopped. In that moment, the Empress was no longer just a ruler. She became a servant to the man who saved her child. The shadow of the mad monk had officially fallen over the throne. Before he was the advisor to the Tsar, he was simply Grigori. Born in 1869 in the remote village of Pokrovskoye, Siberia, his early life was far from holy. In the harsh, frozen wilderness, survival meant being tougher and more ruthless than the land itself. Young Grigori was known as a brawler, a heavy drinker, and a thief. The villagers looked at him with a mix of fear and disgust. They claimed that even as a child, he possessed a strange, 6th sense, an ability to find stolen horses or predict a fire before the first spark appeared. The turning point came in his late 20s. After a period of mysterious illness and a supposed vision of the Virgin Mary, the village drunkard vanished. He left his wife and 3 children behind, disappearing into the vast Russian horizon. For months, he wandered from monastery to monastery, walking thousands of miles with chains under his clothes to punish his flesh. But it wasn't the monks who taught him his most dangerous lessons. Rumors follow Rasputin to this day that he stumbled upon a forbidden sect known as the Klisti. Their secret rituals were a fever dream of madness. They believed that the only way to truly experience God's grace was through the exhaustion of the body. They would dance in circles for hours, chanting and whipping themselves into a frenzy, eventually collapsing into acts of collective sin. Their motto was simple: you cannot repent if you have not sinned. It was here that Rasputin mastered the art of manipulation. He learned that people are most vulnerable when they are caught between shame and ecstasy. He returned to the world not as a man, but as a predator, disguised in a monk's robes. By 1903, the scent of revolution was already in the air of St. Petersburg. But the aristocracy was distracted. Bored by their own wealth, the elite were obsessed with spiritualism, seances, and the occult. They were looking for a miracle, and Rasputin was ready to give it to them. When he arrived, he looked like a wild animal. He was unwashed, he ate with his hands, and his beard was matted with food. To the sophisticated ladies of the court, this wasn't disgusting. It was authentic. They saw him as a holy man straight from the heart of Mother Russia. He was invited to the most exclusive salons, where he would whisper prophecies and touch the souls of the powerful. It wasn't long before Rasputin became the most sought-after man in the capital. His influence was built on a dark charisma. He had a way of looking at a person that made them feel like the only person in the world, or the most guilty. He would tell the high society ladies that for their sins to be washed away, they had to unite with him in prayer, and often in the bedroom. He was creating a web of loyal followers. These women, many of them wives of powerful ministers, began to whisper his name to the Empress. They called him our friend. They called him the Savior. As his bond with the Empress grew, so did his political power. It was no longer just about healing the young Alexei. Rasputin began to advise the Tsar on the appointment of bishops, generals, and even prime ministers. The royal family was in a bubble. Outside the palace, the Russian people were starving, and rumors were spreading. People whispered that the Empress was a German spy, and that Rasputin was her secret lover. The mad monk was no longer just a healer. He was the Shadow King, pulling the strings of an empire that was slowly drifting toward an abyss. In the summer of 1914, the world held its breath. The drums of war were beating across Europe. In Russia, the Tsar was under immense pressure to join the conflict. But from his hospital bed in Siberia, where he was recovering from an assassination attempt by a crazed woman, Rasputin sent a terrifying telegram to the Tsar. He wrote, "A cloud of ghosts hangs over Russia. There will be no light, only a sea of tears and blood." Rasputin knew that if Russia entered the war, the empire would burn. He was a peasant, and he knew that it was the peasants who would die in the mud for a cause they didn't understand. Against Rasputin's warnings, Nicholas II went to war. In 1915, following a series of disastrous defeats, the Tsar made a fatal mistake. He took personal command of the army and moved to the front lines. He left the government in the hands of the Empress Alexandra. But Alexandra was not ruling alone. She was under the total influence of our friend. Behind the scenes, the Siberian peasant became the de facto ruler of Russia. He dismissed competent ministers and replaced them with his own puppets. Every decision was checked with him. The Russian nobility watched in horror as their country was being destroyed by a man who couldn't even read a map. While the soldiers died by the millions at the front, the cities began to starve. In the freezing bread lines of St. Petersburg, people didn't blame the Tsar. They blamed the dark force behind the throne. Vicious rumors reached a boiling point. Cartoons were circulated showing Rasputin holding the Tsar and Empress like dolls. The hatred was no longer whispered. It was screamed. For the Russian aristocracy, the choice became clear. To save the monarchy, they had to kill the monk. The clock was ticking, and the shadows were closing in on Grigori Rasputin. The night of December 16th, 1916, was freezing. The wind howled through the streets of Petrograd like a dying animal. Prince Felix Yusupov, the wealthiest man in Russia, had a plan. He invited Rasputin to his basement, under the pretext of meeting his beautiful wife. But the basement was not a lounge. It was an execution chamber. The air was thick with the scent of expensive incense, trying to hide the smell of death. On the table, there were cakes and wine. But these were no ordinary treats. They were laced with enough potassium cyanide to kill a stable of horses. The conspirators waited upstairs, listening, their hearts pounding in their chests. Rasputin arrived, smiling. He began to eat, one cake, then another. He washed them down with the poisoned wine. Yusupov watched in horror, expecting the monk to collapse in seconds. But Rasputin only complained of a slight scratch in his throat. He asked for more wine. He began to sing. An hour passed, then 2. The poison was useless. Desperate, Yusupov pulled out a silver revolver and shot Rasputin directly in the chest. The monk fell. The conspirators celebrated. It was over. Or so they thought. When Yusupov leaned over the body, Rasputin's eyes suddenly snapped open. He grabbed the prince by the throat, a terrifying growl escaping his lips. "You bad boy," he hissed, before crawling up the stairs and into the snowy courtyard. The conspirators panicked. They chased him into the snow, firing shot after shot. One bullet hit him in the back, another in the head. They beat him with iron bars until his face was unrecognizable. They tied him up in heavy blue curtains and drove to the Great Petrovsky Bridge. They dropped the bundle into a hole in the ice of the Neva River. When his body was found 3 days later, the autopsy revealed something that still haunts historians. There was water in his lungs. Despite the poison, despite the bullets in his chest and brain, despite the brutal beating, Rasputin was still alive when he hit the water. He had died not from the wounds, but from drowning. The man of God had finally met his end, but he had fought death until his very last breath. Grigori Rasputin was dead, but his ghost remained to haunt the halls of the Winter Palace. Shortly before his murder, as if sensing the cold breath of the grave, he had written a final, terrifying letter to the Tsar. He told Nicholas, "If I am killed by common assassins, you have nothing to fear. But if I am killed by your relatives, by the nobility, then within 2 years, not one of your children or relations will be left alive. They will be killed by the Russian people." The aristocrats who celebrated his death in the streets of St. Petersburg thought they had saved the monarchy. They didn't realize they had just pulled out the only pillar holding up a burning roof. Without the mad monk to blame, the people's anger turned directly toward the Tsar. Exactly 10 weeks after Rasputin's body was pulled from the icy Neva, the Russian Revolution erupted. The soldiers refused to fire on the crowds. The Tsar was forced to abdicate. The Romanovs, the family that had ruled for 3 centuries, were suddenly prisoners in their own land. Rasputin's prophecy began to unfold with cold, surgical precision. The blood he had stopped in the young Alexei's veins was now being spilled across the entire nation. In July 1918, less than 2 years after Rasputin's death, the final act of the prophecy was written in a dark basement in Siberia, not far from where Rasputin himself was born. The Tsar, the Empress, and all 5 of their children were lined up against a wall and executed by Bolshevik firing squads. Legend says that the royal daughters had sewn diamonds into their corsets, which acted as armor, causing the bullets to ricochet like sparks in the dark. It took bayonets and shots to the head to finish them. The dynasty was dead. The empire was gone. So who was Grigori Rasputin? A holy man who truly loved his Tsar? Or a dark sorcerer who used hypnosis to destroy a world? History has no easy answer. But one thing is certain. He was a man who rose from the mud of Siberia to the heights of power, and in his fall, he took the largest empire on earth with him into the abyss. Some say his spirit still wanders the streets of St. Petersburg, waiting for the return of the kings he once served.